The psalm Jesus quoted on the cross says God never turned his face away. Verse 24 of that same psalm states it plainly. For he hath not despised nor abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, neither hath he hid his face from him, but when he cried unto him, he heard. That is not a commentary. That is the text. The very psalm everyone cites as proof God abandoned Jesus contains a verse that says the exact opposite. Matthew chapter 27, verse 46. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama Sabachthani. That is to say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? This verse carries more weight than almost anything in the Bible. People have wept through it, prayed it in hospital rooms, sung it on Good Friday with tears on their faces, built their understanding of the entire cross around 6 English words. That weight is real, and it absolutely deserves to be honored. And every single time, someone told them the same thing. God could not look at sin, so he turned away from his own son. But 3 things about this verse do not add up. First, this sentence is the opening line of Psalm 22, not an original cry, a quotation, a psalm that runs 31 verses, and almost nobody reads past the first one. Second, the word translated forsaken is not Hebrew, it is Aramaic. The word Jesus chose is Sabachthani, and it does not mean what you were told it means. Third, the phrase God turned his face away does not appear in any verse of the Bible, not once in the Old Testament, not once in the New. Its most familiar phrasing comes from a worship song written in 1995. One psalm that answers its own question, one Aramaic word flattened into something it never said, one hymn that wrote the theology for millions, and a Greek verb that shows up one more time in Scripture, where God uses it to promise the exact opposite. By the end of this video, you will hold the full psalm, not just the first line. And forsaken will never sound the same. Before we open the psalm, we need to trace where the popular reading actually came from, because it did not come from the text. Ask any church in the English-speaking world what this verse means, and you will hear the same answer. God is too holy to look upon sin. Jesus bore the sin of the world. So the Father turned his face away. That interpretation has been preached from pulpits for generations. It has been printed in study Bible margins. It has shaped how hundreds of millions of Christians understand the most important moment in their faith. But where does it actually appear in Scripture? The verse people point to is Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 13. Thou art of purer eyes than to behold evil, and canst not look on iniquity. Read who is speaking. That is not God describing himself. That is the prophet Habakkuk, confused and frustrated, asking God why wicked nations are allowed to prosper. He is describing what he thinks God should do, not what God has declared about his own nature. That is a complaint, not a doctrine. No verse in the entire Bible records God saying he cannot be present where sin exists. If that were true, the incarnation could not have happened. Jesus touched lepers, ate with tax collectors, entered every broken room in Palestine. God was present through all of it. So where did God turn his face away actually come from? In 1995, the songwriter Stuart Townend wrote a hymn called How Deep the Father's Love for Us. It became one of the most sung worship songs in the Western Church. It appears in at least 8 major hymnals. Congregations around the world have sung it on Good Friday for nearly 30 years, and it contains one line that changed how millions understand the cross. The Father turns his face away. That is not Scripture. That is a lyric, a beautiful lyric, a well-intentioned lyric, but a lyric that traveled from a song sheet into the theology of an entire generation. Now look at the word itself, Sabachthani. This is not Hebrew. This is Aramaic, the everyday spoken language of 1st century Galilee. It comes from the root shebach, listed under Strong's number H7662. Standard lexicons define it as to leave, to forsake, to allow, to permit, but the Aramaic carries a shade that the English flattens completely. In Aramaic, there are stronger words for rejection, words that carry the sense of disgust, of throwing something away because you no longer care. Some Aramaic scholars have pointed to roots that carry the sense of disgusted abandonment, the severing of a relationship because one party has given up. Shebach is not that. Shebach, within its broader semantic range, can carry the sense of leaving for a purpose, releasing, permitting something to unfold. The standard meaning includes forsake, But even within that standard meaning, the texture is purposeful departure, not disgusted rejection. Jesus did not use the harshest Aramaic word available to him. He used shabach. The English word forsaken collapsed both words into one. The him added turned his face away, and the distance between the Aramaic word and the sermon grew wider than the distance between the cry and the answer, because the answer is already inside the psalm, and it has been sitting there for 3,000 years. If the hymn did not write this theology and the proof text does not hold, what does the psalm itself actually say? Psalm 22 is not a cry of despair. It is a psalm with two movements, and no one who quotes the first verse ever seems to arrive at the second. The opening is verse 1. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why art thou so far from helping me and from the words of my roaring? The Hebrew word translated forsaken here is azab. Strong's number H5800. The standard definition in Brown, Driver, and Briggs is broader than most people realize. To leave, to forsake, to loose. The King James Version translates azab as forsake 129 times, but it also translates the same word as leave 72 times, and twice it translates it as help. The root carries the sense of loosening a grip, releasing a hold, not necessarily rejecting. And look carefully at how the verse uses it. Verse 1 is a question. Why hast thou forsaken me? Not a declaration, not a final verdict delivered to an empty sky. A question asked to someone the speaker still trusts enough to address as my God. That question deserves an answer, and the psalm gives one. Verses 2 through 21 are the dissent, the mockery, the isolation. Bones poured out like water, heart melted like wax, tongue stuck to the jaw, dogs surrounding, hands and feet pierced, garments divided, lots cast for clothing. Every detail of the crucifixion is here, laid out in precise order, written 1,000 years before it happened. The azab of this psalm is real suffering, and for anyone who has walked their own dark valley, this psalm does not need explanation. It needs recognition. The dissent is honest. It does not pretend the pain is not there. But then something shifts. Verse 22 changes everything. I will declare thy name unto my brethren. In the midst of the congregation will I praise thee. The tone reverses completely. The cry becomes a song, and it keeps building. Then comes verse 24, the verse nobody preaches. For he hath not despised nor abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, neither hath he hid his face from him. But when he cried unto him, he heard. He hath not hid his face from him. The psalm that opens with, Why have you forsaken me, contains its own answer. God did not hide his face. God heard the cry. The subjective experience of abandonment was real. The actual abandonment was not. Verse 27 expands the scope beyond one person entirely. All the ends of the world shall remember and turn unto the Lord, and all the kindreds of the nations shall worship before thee. And the final line, verse 31, They shall come and shall declare his righteousness unto a people that shall be born, that he hath done this. He hath done this. That same declaration echoes across the Gospels. In John chapter 19, verse 30, Jesus speaks his final word from the cross. It is finished, the Greek word tetelestai, completed, accomplished, done. The psalm that begins with a cry ends with a declaration of completion. The cross that begins in darkness ends with veritheo. It is finished. The arc is identical. The psalm answered its own question before the question was ever asked on the cross. If the psalm answers itself and the Aramaic word carries purpose, why did the Greek translator choose the specific word he used for forsaken? And what happens when you find that same word somewhere else in the New Testament? When the Gospel writer translated the Aramaic Sabachthani into Greek, he used the word egkataleipo, Strong's number G1459. Thayer's lexicon defines it plainly: to abandon, to desert, to leave in straits, to leave helpless. That sounds final. It sounds like proof that the abandonment reading is correct, until you find the same word one more time in the New Testament. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5, I will never leave thee, nor forsake thee. The word translated forsake in that promise is the exact same Greek verb, egkataleipo, G1459. Same word, same entry, same lexicon page. But the writer of Hebrews did not simply use the word. He packed the sentence with 5 Greek negatives spread across 2 verbs, leave and forsake. That is the strongest form of denial that exists anywhere in the language. There is no stronger way to say absolutely never in ancient Greek than to stack 5 separate negative particles into a single promise. And one of those 2 verbs is egkataleipo. Think about what that means. The same word used to describe the worst moment of the cross is the word God chose when he wanted to make an unbreakable promise of presence. He did not choose a different word. He did not avoid the verb because of its association with the crucifixion. He reached for the exact same word and wrapped it in the strongest negation the language allows. The Bible uses the same word for the cry on the cross and for God's most emphatic promise that he will never do that very thing. This is not a contradiction. This is the text showing you the distance between what the cross felt like from the inside and what was actually happening on the outside. And Jesus himself confirmed it the night before. John chapter 16, verse 32. Ye shall be scattered, every man to his own, and shall leave me alone, and yet I am not alone, because the Father is with me. The Father is with me. Look at the timing of that statement. This is not something Jesus said at the beginning of his ministry when everything was going well. This is the night before the cross. The Garden of Gethsemane is hours away. The arrest is coming, the trial, the scourging, the nails. He knew exactly what the next day held. He knew he would cry out from Psalm 22. And with all of that in front of him, he looked his disciples in the eye and said it plainly. The Father is with me. 3 languages now saying the same thing. The Aramaic carries purpose where the English carries rejection. The Hebrew psalm asks the question and answers it 23 verses later. And the Greek verb appears in the cry and in the strongest promise of presence the New Testament contains. If the cry was not abandonment, what was it? Look at what happens immediately after the cry. Matthew chapter 27, verse 51. And behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom, and the earth did quake, and the rocks rent. The barrier between the Holy of Holies and everything outside it tears open, not from the bottom upward, the way a human hand would tear, from the top downward, a direction only one hand could initiate. The earth splits, the rocks crack. The dead rise from their tombs, and a Roman centurion, a man who worshipped no God of Israel, looks at the scene and speaks the first confession. Truly this was the Son of God. In this reading, the sequence maps like a pattern. The cry, then the barrier destroyed, then death overcome, then a man who never saw, suddenly seeing, Sabachthani, a purposeful leaving, not rejection but release. Azab, the loosening, the psalm that asks the question and holds its answer 23 verses later. He hath not hid his face. Egkataleipo, the same word in the cry and in the promise. The text refusing to let you separate the experience of darkness from the certainty of presence. Psalm 22 traces the same arc as the crucifixion scene. Anguish in verse 1, descent through verse 21, then the turn in verse 22, praise in the congregation, all nations remembering, a generation not yet born hearing the declaration. He hath done this. The psalm does not end in the dark. The cross does not end in the dark. Every early reading of this text said the same thing. Augustine called the crucifixion the evening sacrifice. Chrysostom said Jesus spoke from the psalm deliberately, bearing witness to the Old Testament and showing he was of one mind with the Father. Not a single one of them taught that God literally abandoned his own Son. In this reading, the cry maps to the moment awareness passes through total identification with suffering and separation. The dark night, the felt experience that the source is gone. And what follows the cry is the evidence that the source never left. The veil tears, the dead wake. The outsider sees for the first time. Not information about the cross, a pattern, one you may recognize from your own life. The moment the darkness felt most complete was not the end. It was the passage through. If this study on Sabachthani, azab, and egkataleipo opened something for you, the full study guide for this video is available exclusively to members of the Watchman, the 3rd tier on the Join button below. It includes the lexicon sources, the complete psalm structure, and a guided reading of all 31 verses with the decode notes beside each one. For most of your life, you have read only the first verse of a 31-verse psalm. You inherited a reading that stopped at the cry and never arrived at the answer. A reading shaped more by a worship song than by the text it claimed to explain. a reading that told you God turned away when the psalm says plainly that he did not. That reading cost you the second half of the psalm, the half where the cry becomes a song, the half where the nations turn, the half where the final line echoes across the Gospels into the last breath on the cross. But now you hold the full psalm. You hold the Aramaic word that carries purpose, where you were told there was only rejection. You hold the Hebrew root that means loosening, where you were told there was only loss. You hold the Greek verb that makes the opposite promise with the strongest negation the language allows. The darkness was real, the cry was real, and God was there. If you have ever walked through a season so dark that God felt completely absent, if you have felt your own Sabachthani, this psalm was written for you. Not just verse 1, all 31 verses. The cry is yours, but so is the answer. So is the turn. So is the ending that says he hath done this. The next time the darkness comes and your own azab presses in, you do not have to stop at the first line. You can read through to verse 24 and find what was always there. He hath not hid his face from you. When you cried unto him, he heard you. Tonight, read Psalm 22 from verse 1 to verse 31 without stopping. Read verse 1 aloud and let the cry land in your chest. Then read slowly through verses 2 to 21 and feel the descent. Then arrive at verses 22 through 31. Notice the turn. Feel the arc complete itself. The psalm does not end where you were taught it ends. It never did. You can never read this verse the old way again. If you read scripture this way, if the Greek and the Hebrew and the structure of the text matter to you, then you already belong here. The link in the description tells you how to go deeper. This is the awakened believer, and the text is still speaking.